There are some places that look abandoned even when people still live in them. The horse noticed it first. She had been walking for the better part of the afternoon, her left foreleg wrapped in a strip of fabric torn from the bottom of Isley's traveling coat, each step careful, and measured the way injured things move when they are trying very hard not to show how much they hurt. The land around them had been getting quieter for the last several miles. Not the peaceful kind of quiet that settles over a place at the end of a good day. The kind that comes when something essential has been missing for a long time, and the landscape itself has slowly grown accustomed to the absence, the way a room adjusts to furniture that has been removed, filling the empty space not with anything new, but simply with a different quality of air. Isley had ridden through a lot of country in her years. She knew the difference between land that was resting and land that had been left. This land had been left. Then the fence line appeared. It ran along the ridge like something that had once meant business, and had then simply given up. Some posts still stood straight, planted deep enough to resist the years. Others leaned at angles that made no structural sense, held in place by nothing more substantial than habit and the dry, packed earth that had closed around their bases over many seasons of freeze and thaw. The wire between them sagged in long, weary loops, not snapped, not vandalized, just no longer held to any useful tension. There was a particular sadness to wire that still connected things, but no longer kept anything in or out. It went through all the motions of a fence while performing none of the functions. Isley stopped walking and looked at it for a long moment. Her father had taught her to read land the way some people read faces. Every property tells you something about the person who tends it, he used to say. He would stop their wagon on the road and point to a distant farm and ask her what she saw, not what was there, but what the state of it told her about the life being lived inside it. She had learned to read broken hinges and overgrown kitchen gardens and windows that had been covered from the inside rather than the outside. She had learned that the condition of a fence, specifically, told you almost everything worth knowing, because a fence was work that never ended, that demanded regular attention and offered no reward beyond the prevention of problems. And the people who kept their fences were people who still believed in prevention. These fences had not been tended in a long time. She clicked her tongue softly, a small sound meant only for the horse. The horse turned her elegant head, ears swiveling forward with the question they always asked when they heard that sound, then exhaled through her nose in a long, tired breath that communicated everything about how the last 2 days had gone, and how her considered opinion of the entire situation had not improved. "I know," Isley said quietly. "Me too." She followed the fence line south until she found a gate, and beyond the gate, a road that had once been traveled regularly and was now more suggestion than fact. 2 shallow grooves pressed into the dry grass by years of wheels and hooves, leading toward a cluster of buildings settled in the middle distance, like something that had grown up out of the land rather than been built upon it. A main house, stone and heavy timber, with the solid permanence of structures built by hand without reference to anything fashionable or temporary, built simply to last. A barn set back at an angle from the house, large enough that it had required serious effort to construct. A smaller outbuilding beyond it, purpose unclear from this distance. And near the barn, a water trough with a rusted pump handle standing at attention beside it, patient as a soldier waiting for orders that were slow to arrive. No smoke from the chimney, though the afternoon air carried enough chill to justify a fire. No dogs running out to meet them, no movement in the yard, no sound of tools or voices, no evidence anywhere of the ordinary productive noise that working land tended to generate. Isley looked at her horse. Her horse looked at the water trough with the focused intensity of a creature that had its priorities clearly arranged. "All right," Isley said, and they walked toward it together. She was working the pump handle, coaxing water up through the dry throat of it with the particular patience that old pumps required. A firm downward pull, and then a wait, and then another, when she heard boots on the hard ground behind her. Not hurrying. Not cautious either, just walking with the unhurried authority of a man moving across land he has crossed 10,000 times before, who is not sure yet whether the person standing at his water trough represents a problem or merely an inconvenience, and is taking his time deciding. She turned before he reached her. She had learned young that it mattered which direction you were facing when you met a stranger. He was taller than the proportions of the buildings had led her to expect, broad through the shoulders in a way that spoke of work rather than intention, with the particular physical economy of men who have spent years doing heavy labor and have had all the unnecessary movement worn away, leaving only what was actually needed. He looked to be in his middle 40s, though the kind of life that left its marks on a face could shift that estimate in either direction. His hair was dark with the beginning of gray at the temples. His eyes were darker still, and they moved over her with a steady, unhurried assessment that took in her face, her clothes, the traveling bag she had set down near the trough, and then moved to the horse, settling there with an attention that sharpened in a way she noticed. He looked at the wrapped foreleg for a long moment. Then he looked back at her. He did not speak. Isley had spent enough years moving through the world alone to have catalogued most varieties of silence. There was hostile silence, the kind that had a shape like a wall. There was suspicious silence, which watched and calculated. There was the silence of people who wanted you to speak first so they could hear the quality of your voice before they decided anything. This was none of those. It was something more unfamiliar. The silence of a man who had simply arrived at the conclusion, at some point in the past, that words were a limited instrument and had stopped reaching for them unless something specifically required it. It was, she would think later, the silence of someone who had given up expecting anything to be worth the effort of response, which was a very different thing from someone who was merely being rude. "Stone bruise," she said, because she was not someone who waited easily when there was something clear to say. Her left foreleg, possibly a small fracture at the outer edge of the coffin bone, though I don't believe so. She needs a few days off her feet before I can be certain. He looked at the horse again. Something shifted in the set of his jaw, some small interior recalibration she could not fully read. His eyes moved along the length of the wrapped leg with the attention of someone who knew enough about horses to evaluate what he was seeing. "There's a stall in the barn," he said finally, his voice lower than she had expected, with the particular quality of a voice that was not often used. "Empty." He turned and walked toward the barn without waiting for her response. The matter, apparently, was settled. She followed him with the horse, and as she did, she looked at the yard around her more carefully. A split-rail fence near the barn, recently repaired, the new wood pale against the weathered gray of the rest of it. Just that section. Everywhere else, the same slow exhaustion she had seen along the ridgeline. A water barrel beside the house with a crack that had been wrapped with wire but not properly repaired. A kitchen garden plot, the soil still good. She could see that from the color and texture of it, but planted with only the most basic provisions and not tended beyond the minimum necessary to produce them. There was evidence in the layout of the garden, in the spacing, and the careful orientation of its rows toward the afternoon light, that someone had once planned it with real intention. Someone who understood growing things and had cared about getting them right. A shovel leaning against the barn wall where it had been set down and not yet put away. Perhaps recently, perhaps months ago. A ranch keeping itself alive, but only just. The barn was better inside than out, which told her something. The animals had not been neglected. Their stalls were clean, their water buckets full, their feed appropriate and in good condition. Whatever had caused the withdrawal of care from the exterior of the property had not reached inward as far as the living things that depended on it. That told her something too. Theron, who had not yet offered his name, showed her to an empty stall at the end of the row without ceremony. He unlatched it, stood aside. She led the horse in, and he watched as she began to settle the animal, his arms loose at his sides, not helping but not leaving either, in the way of someone who is not sure yet what the appropriate distance is. It was then that she heard the older man come in through the side door of the barn. A man she would learn was called Jed, who had the face of someone who had made peace with most things, and the hands of someone who had worked every day of his adult life without complaint or question. He was perhaps 55, perhaps older, with a slight forward lean to his posture that suggested decades of bending toward one task or another had simply become the natural shape of him. He looked at her. He looked at the horse. He helped her with the water bucket and the straw without being asked, moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who had been tending to animals in this barn for a long time and knew where everything was kept without having to look. It was Jed who told her the name of the place. The Cask Ranch, he said, though the word ranch seemed too energetic for what she had seen of it so far. It was Jed who told her the name of the man who had walked her to the stall and then left without introduction. Theron Cask. Jed said the name with a careful neutrality that carried more information than most people managed with full sentences. She was checking the quality of the feed, running a handful between her fingers to assess it, when she saw the calf. It was in the corner stall, lying on its side in the particular way that immediately told her what she needed to know. The angle of its neck, the shallow, too rapid rhythm of its breathing, the tight, distended drum of its small belly. It had the quality of something that had moved past the point of protest and arrived at a place of quiet waiting. She set the feed down and walked to the stall without speaking. She knelt in the straw and ran her hands along the calf's neck and flank, reading what was there with the unhurried attention her father had taught her. She recognized the presentation completely. Her father had shown her this exact condition when she was 12 years old, standing in a barn that smelled of the same combination of dry hay and old wood and animal warmth that this one did, and she had stored it with the care she gave to everything he taught her, permanently and precisely, the way the mind stores things that come from someone you are afraid of losing. She looked up at Jed, who was standing in the doorway of the stall with the lantern. "This isn't what it looks like," she said. "The fermentation's already happened. She needs the gas released. Tonight. If you wait until morning, she won't be here." Jed's face moved through several things quickly. What settled at the end of it was relief. The specific relief of someone who has been watching a situation deteriorate without knowing what to do about it and has been carrying that helplessness alone. She worked for the better part of an hour. It was not complicated, but it required patience and steady hands and the willingness to continue past the point where things looked worse before they looked better, which was the point at which most people stopped. Jed held the lantern exactly where she needed it and passed her what she asked for without fumbling. and she understood from this that he was a man who knew how to assist, who had learned the discipline of following competent direction without inserting himself into it. When it was finished, when the calf had been helped to its feet and stood there on uncertain legs with the confused dignity of something that did not fully understand what had just happened to it, but recognized that the worst had passed, Jed let out a breath that seemed to carry a great deal of weight with it. "Lord," he said softly. Not to her, not quite to the calf, to something more general. "Keep her standing as much as she'll allow tonight," Isley said, wiping her hands. "Water, but no feed until morning. She should be all right." Jed nodded. He was still looking at the calf. Then he looked at Isley with an expression she was only beginning to understand. The expression of a man who had been carrying something heavier than he should have been carrying alone, and had just, unexpectedly, and without arrangement, had someone take hold of the other end of it. The house was warm inside in the way of well-built stone houses that hold the day's heat like a promise made early and kept late. The main room was kitchen and living space together, a wide plank table at its center worn smooth by years of use, a fireplace along the north wall with a low fire in it that had been tended to the minimum required and no further. Shelves along one wall, a coat hook by the door with one coat on it, a single cup on the table, recently used, still faintly warm when she passed close to it. Jed showed her to a small room down the hallway. A narrow bed, a west-facing window, a wooden chair, a hook on the back of the door. Clean and spare. She set her bags down and stood for a moment in the way she always stood in new rooms, taking inventory, understanding the space before she occupied it. She was walking back toward the main room when she passed the door that stood slightly open. She had not meant to look. She was thinking about the calf, about checking on her horse once more before sleeping, and she passed the door, and the thin line of fading light from the window inside fell across the hallway floor, and she registered in the peripheral way you register things before you consciously notice them. The objects arranged inside. She stopped. Through the gap, she could see a portion of a room. A narrow bed with a patchwork quilt in blues and greens, the colors still bright in the way of things that have been carefully maintained. The corner of a wooden chest. A shelf with objects on it whose details she could not make out in the dim light. And on the floor beside the door, placed with a neatness that was somehow more affecting than any kind of disorder could have been, a pair of small boots. A boy's boots. Worn at the toes in the way that boys' boots are always worn, scuffed along the sides from the particular physical transactions of a child moving through an ordinary day, running and climbing and dragging his feet through loose dirt in the specific way that drove the people who loved him to exasperation. They were not dusty. Someone had been keeping them clean. She turned away from the door and walked back toward the main room and did not look at the boots again and did not think about them directly, the way you do not look at a very bright light when your eyes are not prepared for it. Theron was standing at the window when she came back, looking out toward the barn with the particular quality of stillness she was coming to recognize as specific to him, a stillness that was not restful, that had the quality of effort behind it, of a person holding themselves in place, because the alternative was something they had decided not to allow. She moved to the fire and stood near it without speaking. There was something in the quality of his stillness that asked for the same, and she had learned over many years that the impulse to fill a silence was sometimes the least respectful thing a person could do. He said without turning, "The calf." "She should be all right," Easley said. "Jed's with her." A small nod, contained. Then, "You know what you're doing. My father was a traveling doctor, she said. Human patients when he could get them, animals when he couldn't. I rode with him from the time I could sit a horse. She paused. He said the skills transferred more than people expected. He was right about most things. Theron turned from the window then, and she saw his face fully for the first time in proper light. The deep lines around his eyes that came from years of sun and wind rather than from laughter. The set of his mouth trained into careful neutrality, and beneath all of it, beneath the weathering and the practiced composure, something she recognized because she had seen its cousin in other faces, in her father's face near the end, in patients who had survived something they had not expected to survive, and were still working out what to do with the fact of their continuation. It was the look of a person who had not yet decided whether the world still deserved their full attention. He held her eyes for a moment longer than was strictly conversational. Then he set his cup on the table and walked toward the hallway. "Food on the shelf," he said without turning back. "Help yourself." His door closed at the end of the hall, quiet and final, like a sentence ending. Isley stood by the fire and listened to the house breathe around her. She looked at the shelf. Provisions enough to keep a person functioning without any investment in the experience of it. Nothing prepared with anticipation or care. A household maintaining the minimum requirements of continuation. She took a piece of bread and ate it standing up by the fire, not because she was hungry, but because she was thinking. And she thought better when her hands had something simple to do. She thought about the fence line she had followed down from the ridge, the wire hanging in tired loops between posts that had given up caring about their angle. She thought about the kitchen garden with its good soil and its minimal planting, and the deliberate spacing of those rows that spoke of someone who had once brought real knowledge and love to that ground. She thought about Jed's face when the calf stood up. She thought about the boots beside the door that were not dusty, that someone kept clean with a care that was applied to nothing else she had yet seen on this property. She had planned to stay one night, perhaps two, until she could properly assess the foreleg. She had been moving for long enough that she had mostly stopped thinking about where she was going and thought instead only about where she was, which had the advantage of simplicity and the disadvantage of never arriving anywhere that felt like it required her to stay. She finished the bread and went to her room. She was folding her coat over the chair when she went to the window out of habit and looked toward the barn. The night was clear, the cold of it pressing against the glass, and the yard was dark and still. Then she saw him. He came out of the small side door of the barn and crossed the dark yard without a lantern, walking with the certainty of a man who did not need to see the path because his feet had learned it without his conscious participation. He walked to the far back corner of the yard where the fence had been repaired, that one section of straight posts and new wire standing in contrast to everything else, and he stopped there. He did not lean on the fence, did not look over it or check its condition. He simply stood with his arms at his sides, looking out at the dark fields beyond. And then, after a moment, the horse in the nearest stall shifted, and Isley heard through the cold glass the sound of an animal moving close to someone, the soft exhale of a large creature setting its weight against a shoulder offered to receive it. Theron did not move. He stood there in the dark, in the cold, with the old horse's head resting against him, and he looked out at nothing, and his arms stayed at his sides, and he did not move. Isley stood at the window for a long moment. Then she let the curtain fall and turned away, and sat down on the edge of the narrow bed in the small, quiet room. Outside, the night settled around the ranch with the heavy patience of something that had been waiting a long time and had learned not to be in a hurry. She thought, 2 more days. Until the leg was certain. She thought, maybe 3. She lay back on the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling and listened to the distant, steady sound of the barn, of living things doing the slow and patient work of continuing. She did not sleep for a long time. The second morning arrived the way second mornings at unfamiliar places always do, with a particular quality of light that makes everything look slightly different than it did the night before. Not better or worse, just more honestly itself, stripped of the forgiving ambiguity of first impressions and left to stand in its actual condition without assistance. Isley was up before the sun had finished deciding whether it was going to commit to the day. She had slept in fragments, the way she always slept in new places, surfacing and submerging at irregular intervals, her mind doing the quiet work of cataloging sounds and assigning them to their proper categories of concern or dismissal. The creak of old timber contracting in the cold, the distant shifting of animals in the barn, wind finding its way through the gap in the stonework she had located the night before. At some point in the deep middle of the night, she had heard footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate, pausing for a moment outside her door and then continuing toward the back of the house, and she had lain still and listened until they faded into silence. And the silence faded back into the general quiet of the sleeping house. She dressed in the gray pre-dawn and went to check on the calf. The barn held its warmth the way good barns do, the combined heat of the animals inside it creating something close to comfortable even in the cold of early morning. The calf was standing, not with confidence, not with any particular enthusiasm for the vertical position, but standing, leaning against the wall of her stall with the resigned pragmatism of a creature that had been through something difficult and was conserving resources until she had a better sense of what would be required of her next. Aisley checked her over with careful hands, running her palms along the belly, listening to the breathing, pressing 2 fingers lightly against the angle of the jaw to feel the pulse. Better. Not well, but decisively better, which was all this stage of recovery needed to be. Her own horse was awake and watching from the adjacent stall with the alert, faintly accusatory expression of an animal that had developed opinions about the current situation and was waiting for the appropriate moment to make them known at length. Aisley unwrapped the foreleg and examined it in the growing light, running her fingers along the bone with the slow deliberation her father had taught her, feeling for heat, for irregularity, for any change in the swelling from the night before. The swelling had reduced, not gone, but reduced, which confirmed her initial assessment and allowed her to set aside the possibility of fracture with reasonable confidence. She rewrapped the leg with fresh fabric, speaking quietly as she worked. The low, continuous murmur that her father had taught her was less about words than about consistency. Something warm and unbroken in the air to tell the animal that the person handling her had no urgency in their body, that there was nothing in the immediate environment that required alarm. She was securing the final wrap when she heard someone enter the barn through the main doors. Not Jed. She had already learned the particular rhythm of Jed's walk, the slight drag of his left boot sole that he had probably stopped hearing years ago, worn into his gait so gradually that it had become indistinguishable from his own natural pattern. This was a different step entirely, heavier, more deliberate, the step of a man who had made a decision about being somewhere, and arrived with that decision fully inhabiting his body. Theron moved past the stall where she was working without any acknowledgement of her presence, which she was coming to understand was not rudeness, but rather the behavior of a man for whom the social performance of noticing people had become something he could not sustain without considerable effort, and who therefore reserved that effort for moments when it was genuinely necessary. He went to the far end of the row, to the stall where the old gray horse with the white blaze stood waiting with the particular quality of patience that very old animals develop. A patience that is not passive, but deeply active, that has learned through long experience that the people it loves will arrive when they arrive, and that anxiety about the interval serves no one. He filled the water bucket with the unhurried efficiency of someone who has done the same task 10,000 times. He checked the feed. He ran one hand along the horse's neck in a long, slow stroke that had no audience in it whatsoever, no performance, nothing directed outward, just a man and an old horse in the early morning doing what they did. Isley watched for a moment, then turned back to her own work. They occupied the barn together for the better part of an hour without speaking. The silence between them had a quality she was still working to understand, different from the silences she was accustomed to navigating, which generally had a temperature and a direction, some emotional current running through them that required management. This silence had no current. It was simply two people attending to what was in front of them in the same space at the same time, each fully occupied and neither making demands on the other's attention. She found it unexpectedly restful. When she left the barn and went to the kitchen, she prepared enough breakfast for two people without deciding to. She had been feeding herself alone for long enough that the habit of single portions was deeply ingrained, and the fact that her hands reached for more than she needed was information she chose not to examine too closely at this particular hour of the morning. She ate standing at the window, looking out at the yard, watching the light come fully into the day. Then she left the second plate on the table and went out to walk the eastern fence line she had been planning to assess since her first afternoon. She was gone for nearly 2 hours. The fence along the eastern edge of the property was in worse condition than the western side. 2 sections that had come fully down, and a third that was held together by a combination of luck and old wire, wrapped around a post at an angle that suggested improvisation rather than intention. She made notes in her mind about what repair would require, the number of posts, the length of wire, the tools that were or were not present in the storage building. When she came back through the main room, the second plate was in the wash basin. Clean. She looked at it for a moment. Then she went to find Jed. She spent the afternoon in the storage building, which turned out to be a project of considerable scope. The space had been allowed to accumulate the residue of years without any organizing principle beyond the general one of putting things somewhere inside a roof, and the result was a layered sediment of tools, provisions, spare parts, and miscellaneous objects that told the history of the ranch, the way geological strata tell the history of the land. The older and more purposeful things at the bottom, the more recent and more haphazard things on top. She worked through it methodically, the way her father had taught her to approach any space that needed understanding before it could be useful. Jed appeared in the doorway after a while and leaned against the frame, watching her with the expression of a man who has coexisted with a problem for so long that he has stopped registering it as a problem and is now experiencing the faint disorientation of seeing it addressed. She did not ask him to help or to leave. She kept working. "How long have you been here?" she asked, not looking up from the crate she was sorting. 17 years, Jed said. "Came on when the elder cask was still running things. Stayed on after." He was quiet for a moment. "Just stayed." She heard the plainness of that last word and left it where he had said it. "And before," she said carefully, picking through the contents of the crate. "Before the last few years. What was it like?" The pause before Jed answered was long enough that she looked up. He was looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone examining a photograph of a place that no longer exists in quite the same form. "Good," he said, and the word carried more in it than its single syllable suggested. It was a working ranch, a real one. Theron knew what he was doing from the time he was young. Not in the way some men know things, by following what they've been told. In the way that comes from paying attention to something long enough that it starts to tell you things nobody taught you. Jed shifted his weight. And the boy was the same. Eli. Like the land was a language he'd been born already speaking. Isley's hands went still for just a moment on the tool she was holding. Then she continued. "He sounds like he belonged here," she said. "Born to it," Jed said. "The kind of belonging that's different from just living somewhere. The kind where you and the place have an understanding." He stopped. The muscles of his jaw worked briefly. He'd have been 19 now. Neither of them spoke after that for a long while. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass with its patient, explanatory sound, and the light shifted as the afternoon progressed, and Isley worked through the contents of the storage building with steady, quiet attention while Jed stayed in the doorway, not quite ready to leave and not quite ready to say more, occupying that particular kind of companionship that does not require conversation to be real. She thought about the boots beside the door. She thought about the repaired section of fence at the back of the yard, those pale new posts standing among the weathered gray of everything else, like something that refused to accept the general surrender. She had been reading that fence wrong since the first morning. She had assumed it was the beginning of a repair that had been abandoned. She was beginning to understand that it was something else entirely, something that required a different kind of reading. She set the thought aside and kept working. The first time Percival Lorne arrived at the ranch, he came in the way that certain kinds of men arrive in places they have already decided belong to them, with a warmth so practiced it had become indistinguishable from the real thing, unless you were paying the particular kind of attention that Isley habitually paid. He rode into the yard on a horse that was too well maintained for the roads he had apparently been traveling, wearing clothes that occupied the precise intersection of practical and expensive that requires deliberate effort to achieve. He was perhaps 50, with a broad, open face, wearing an expression of permanent goodwill that she recognized immediately as something that had been trained rather than grown. The expression of a man who had determined at some formative point that goodwill was the most effective thing to lead with, and had practiced it until the practice became invisible. He called out Theron's name from the yard with the easy familiarity of someone who had done so many times before. Theron came out from the barn, and Isley, who was near the water trough, stayed where she was and watched without appearing to. The embrace was brief in the way of a gesture that one person wanted and the other permitted. Lorne's hand on Theron's shoulder, one squeeze, the smile arriving fully formed. She watched the smile reach his eyes and noted the route it took to get there, arriving approximately half a second after it had already appeared on his mouth, the delay so small that most people would not catch it. She caught it. He noticed her immediately, which she had expected. What she had not expected was the specific quality of how he noticed her. Not the suspicion of a man encountering an unknown presence on territory he considered his own, but something more interested and more carefully managed. The expression of a person walking into a familiar room and finding that the furniture has been rearranged in ways that will need to be accounted for. "I didn't know you had help," Lorne said to Theron. his voice carrying warmth as naturally as other voices carried breath. "She's passing through," Theron said. "Her horse needed rest." "Of course." Lorne looked at her directly. He had the eyes of a man who was always counting something. "Percival Lorne, I'm family, of a sort." She gave him her name and nothing more. He seemed to find this charming in the way that men like him find most things charming when the things do not yet represent a problem for them. They went inside, Theron and Lorne, and she stayed in the yard and thought about what she had just seen. She thought about the smile that led by half a second. She thought about the phrase of a sort, which was either genuine modesty or strategic precision, and she was not yet certain which, though she had a direction she was leaning. She was still thinking about it later that afternoon when Theron came back outside and found her at the repaired section of fence at the back of the yard, her hand resting on one of the new posts, looking out at the field beyond it. She had not planned to say anything. She turned and looked at him and made a decision about what she was willing to be in this moment. "He'll come back," she said. Theron looked at her without surprise, more like a man hearing a sound he recognized from a door he had known was there. "I know," he said. "You knew before I said it." "Yes?" She held his gaze steadily. "Then you know what he wants." Something moved through his expression, layered and tired. "I know what he says he wants." "What does he say?" Theron was quiet for a moment. He looked out across the back field at the grass that had been growing without management, and the fence line that stretched away in its state of long exhaustion, and the barn roof that needed a proper assessment before the hard weather came. He looked at all of it with the eyes of a man who sees exactly what is there, and has not yet decided what his responsibility to it is. "He says the ranch needs managing," Theron said. "That I'm not in a position to provide it adequately. That he wants to help." He paused. "That it's what the family would have wanted." The last sentence landed in the space between them with its particular weight. "Being right about the state of a thing," Isley said carefully, "doesn't make a person right about what ought to be done about it." Theron looked at her then, a full, direct look of the kind he rarely gave, and she felt the quality of his attention the way you feel a change in air pressure, not uncomfortable, just present and significant. He did not respond, but something in his eyes shifted in a way she was learning to read, a slight change in focus, like a lens adjusting, and she understood that he had heard her and was storing what she had said in the place where he stored things that mattered. 4 days after Lorne's visit, the storm came through. It arrived in the afternoon with the purposeful speed of weather that has already made its decision, the sky moving from overcast to threatening in less time than it took to get the horses into the interior stalls. Isley had been watching the clouds build since mid-morning with the habitual attention her father had drilled into her, reading the color and the movement and the particular quality of the light at the horizon, and she had already moved the calf to a safer position and identified the compromised section of barn roof before the wind had properly begun. She found Theron and told him about the roof in the direct, unembellished way she delivered information she considered immediately actionable. He looked at the sky. He looked at the barn. He did not waste anything on deliberation. They worked through the next 2 hours with the focused efficiency of people who have no attention to spare. For anything that is not the task at hand, they moved through the preparation of the barn, securing the animals, reinforcing the feed stores against water, blocking the draft that came under the south wall. They were not perfectly coordinated. There were moments when their approaches met at cross purposes, when she reached for a tool he was already using, when he moved to address one problem while she had assessed a different one as more urgent. But the collisions were brief and practical, each making adjustments to accommodate the other without either of them making those adjustments into subjects of discussion, and the overall result was work that progressed faster than either of them would have managed alone. Then they were on the roof. She had gone up first because she had identified the problem and knew exactly where it was, and he had followed without being asked because he was that kind of man, the kind who appeared where the work required him without needing the situation to be explained. They worked side by side on the compromise section as the wind built around them, the sky the color of old pewter in every direction, the first drops of rain beginning to find them at irregular intervals. She was working the near edge of the damaged section, and he was working the far, and she heard the change in his footing before she saw it. A shift in the quality of sound from boot on weathered wood, a fraction of a second where the weight distribution changed in a way that was wrong, and her body understood it and moved before her mind had fully processed the information, her hand closing around his forearm just below the elbow as he caught his balance against the pitch of the roof. They were both absolutely still for one moment. The wind pressed against them with genuine force. Below and inside, the horses called to each other in the specific register of animals that are not panicked but are paying close attention. The rain was beginning properly now, the first cold drops becoming something more committed, and the sky in every direction had the dense, purposeful gray of weather that intended to continue for some time. She looked at him. He was looking at her hand on his forearm. Then he looked up at her face, and she saw something in his eyes that she had not seen there before. A quality of being fully present. Fully in this specific moment, rather than somewhere slightly behind it, the look of a man who has been startled back into the present tense from a considerable distance and is finding it, against his expectations, habitable. She released his arm. He straightened. They looked at each other for one moment more, in the roaring gray of the afternoon, and then they both turned back to the roof and finished the repair. By the time they climbed down, the rain had become serious. They ran across the yard and came through the door into the house at the same moment, which created a brief and somewhat graceless negotiation of the threshold that under other circumstances might have been amusing. Inside, dripping on the entry floor, both of them breathing from the exertion and the cold, Theron looked at the state of her, thoroughly soaked and disheveled, her hair plastered flat, and her traveling coat darker with rain than its original color, and something happened at the corner of his mouth. It lasted approximately 1 second, but she saw it clearly, the ghost of what a smile would look like on that particular face if it had been given more recent opportunity to practice, there and gone, before it could be called anything as definitive as an expression. They dried off separately and came back to the main room. The fire had burned low, and she built it back up while he put water on, and she understood, without needing it, explained that this was how he managed what he could not say, through small practical actions performed in the direction of another person, hot coffee in weather that called for it, a door held open, the second plate found empty in the wash basin. He set a cup in front of her and sat down at the table across from her, and she noted that this was the first time since her arrival that he had sat at the table with another person present, and she did not remark on it, simply wrapped her hands around the cup and let the warmth of it come through her palms while the rain drove against the windows and the fire found its rhythm again. They sat together for a long while without speaking. Jed was in the barn, had insisted on staying with the animals through the storm with the particular stubbornness of a man whose faithfulness to certain things had become inseparable from his understanding of himself. Theron looked at the table, The rain made its complicated percussion on the roof they had repaired together, and it held. She could hear it holding. "You're still here," he said finally. "My horse needs another week," she said. He looked up at her with those direct, steady eyes. "Is that the only reason?" The question sat between them on the worn surface of the old table, like something that had been waiting a long time to be asked, and was now simply present, requiring nothing except an honest answer. Isley looked at him. She thought about the boots beside the door. She thought about the fence at the back of the yard, pale new wood in all the gray. She thought about the empty plate in the wash basin and the coffee always hot before she reached the kitchen, and the way he had stood at the window the first night, looking at something that was no longer there to be seen. "No," she said, simply and without additional weight, the way she tried to say things that were true without dressing them in more or less than they were. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at his cup, and the quality of his stillness shifted in a way she felt across the table. Some small interior door that had been kept shut for a long time opening, just enough to change the quality of the air on the other side of it. Outside, the storm continued with its business. Inside, the fire burned with the steady, reliable warmth of a thing that has been properly attended to, and the rain tested the roof and found it sound, and the silence between the two people at the table had changed in some way that neither of them named, but both of them understood. That evening, after Theron had ridden out to check the damage on the eastern pasture, and the house had settled into its quiet, Jed sat at the table with Isley and told her about the afternoon by the river. He told it in the way people tell things they have carried alone, past the point that carrying it alone is sustainable, not all at once, not in order, but the way weight comes off a person when they finally allow it, gradually and with the care of someone who has learned that release too rapid can cause a different kind of harm. He told her about Eli at 16, about the river in the western field that ran differently in different seasons, quiet and navigable in the dry months, and something else altogether when the highlands were melting. About an afternoon 3 years ago, when Theron had been working the eastern fence, and had heard something from the direction of the water, and had made a judgment about what he was hearing, had finished the section of fence he was on, had walked toward the river after. Jed stopped for a long time. His cup sat untouched. "He got there," Jed said. But the time between hearing and going was the wrong amount of time. He looked at the table, and Theron has been living in that interval ever since, going over it, trying to find the moment where a different decision was available, rebuilding that fence like if he can get it right enough times he can go back and choose differently. Isley sat with this information and let it settle where it needed to settle. She thought about the way Theron moved through his own property like a man who has been asked to caretake something that used to be his. The minimal meals, the one cup on the table, the way he worked the animals with care and attention while the rest of the ranch declined around him, as though he had made some internal determination about what he was still permitted to tend and what he had forfeited the right to. "Does he know you know?" she asked. "He knows. We just don't say it." Jed looked up at her. Until now, there wasn't anyone to say it to. She nodded slowly. Outside, the last of the storm was moving east, the rain thinning to a cold mist that made the darkness visible in a particular way, layered and close. Somewhere on the western edge of the property, a river was running with the complete indifference of water that does not record what it has passed through. She went to her room and sat on the edge of the narrow bed with her father's notebook open on her knees, the one she carried always and opened rarely because the handwriting inside it still had the power to stop her breath. She turned to the back pages he had left blank, and she sat for a while without writing. Then she wrote one line. She looked at it. She closed the notebook. She looked at the window, at the dark where the barn was, and she thought about a man standing at a fence in the night with an old horse's weight against his shoulder, looking at a field where something had happened that he could not stop happening, not in his mind, not in the repeated labor of his hands. She had been moving for a long time. Moving was what she knew. The feeling of a place at your back rather than around you. The particular freedom of someone who has decided that belonging somewhere only makes the leaving harder. She looked at the window for a long time. Then she lay back on the narrow bed, and she did not tell herself anything definitive. But she stopped, for the first time in longer than she could precisely locate, telling herself to keep moving. Outside, the ranch settled into its nighttime quiet, and the repaired roof held the last of the rain, and the calf that had been dying was breathing steadily in her stall. Easley lay in the narrow bed and listened to all of it. The sleeplessness had a different quality than it had on the first night, less like the vigilance of someone passing through, more like the wakefulness of someone who is, against all previous intention, beginning to arrive. The morning after Jed told her about the river, Isley woke before dawn and lay still for a long time before getting up. She had a habit, developed over years of moving through unfamiliar places, of taking inventory of herself before she took inventory of the day. A few minutes of quiet attention to the interior state before the exterior one demanded its share of her. It was something her father had practiced and passed on without ever naming it as a practice, simply by doing it visibly enough that she absorbed it the way children absorb the rituals of the people who raise them, completely and without question. This morning, the interior inventory took longer than usual. There was more to account for. She got up eventually and dressed and went to the barn in the cold gray before sunrise and did the work that needed doing. The calf was well enough now to be considered out of danger, which was a different category from well, but a significant one. Her own horse was putting more weight on the foreleg with each passing day, the improvement steady and in the right direction. Isley changed the wrap and assessed the progress and spoke to the horse in the low, continuous way that was more habit than intention, and the horse listened with the quality of attention that certain animals give to certain people, complete and without reservation. She left a plate on the table and went to walk the western fence line. She had been avoiding the western fence. She recognized this about herself without particular judgment. She was someone who moved toward difficult things eventually, but she allowed herself to approach on her own terms and in her own time. And the western fence had required some preparation that she was only now ready to complete. She walked the full length of it, from the northern corner where it joined the boundary with the adjacent property down to the southern edge where it met the bank of the dry creek bed. It was in better condition than the other lines, she noted. Not good condition, but better. Some sections had been recently checked, the wire tested, a post reset where it had begun to lean. The attention was uneven, concentrated in certain areas and absent in others. But it was there. Someone had walked this fence not long ago and done what they could. She reached the western edge of the property and stopped. The river was visible from here, perhaps a quarter-mile further west through a stand of trees whose leaves had turned and thinned enough to leave the water visible as a moving brightness between the dark trunks. She could hear it faintly, the low, continuous sound of water finding its way over stone and root, the utterly indifferent voice of something that does not remember and does not need to. She stood and looked at it for a long time. Not because she needed to, because she thought it was important to look at things directly. Then she turned and walked back toward the ranch. She found Theron at the water trough, refilling the barrel for the barn, and she walked up beside him and stood there for a moment before speaking. "The western fence needs 2 new posts between the 3rd and 4th marker," she said. "The wire there is holding, but not well. Another hard frost will compromise it." He looked at her. She could feel him deciding something about the fact that she had walked the western fence at all, understanding what that walk had meant in terms of what she now knew about the geography of the property and its significance. She waited while he decided. "I know," he said. "I can help you set them." A pause. "It's not necessary." "I know it isn't," she said. "I'm offering anyway." He looked at her for a moment longer with those steady, measuring eyes, and then he nodded once. And that was the end of the conversation and the beginning of the arrangement. They set the fence posts 3 days later, on a morning when the light was good, and the ground had softened enough from an overnight rain to accept the posts without the backbreaking work that frozen ground required. They worked side by side with the focused quiet of people who have learned each other's rhythms well enough that the work flows without the constant negotiation that strangers require. She held the post while he tamped the earth around the base. He held the wire taut while she secured the tension. Neither of them looked at the river, which was visible from where they worked, a moving brightness through the thinned trees, present without being addressed. When the second post was set and the wire rerun and tested, Theron stood back and looked at what they had done. She stood beside him. The fence looked in this section the way the whole property must have looked once, tended and purposeful, holding its lines against the open country with the quiet confidence of something that had been properly maintained. "He used to ride this fence with me," Theron said. He said it to the fence rather than to her, which she understood was the only way some things could be said at first, directed at the neutral object rather than the person, keeping the emotional exposure to a manageable level while the words found their way into the air. She did not respond immediately. She waited to see if there was more. "From the time he was old enough to sit a horse without help, rode the full perimeter with me every spring, checking what the winter had done." Theron's voice had the quality of something being retrieved from a significant depth, brought up carefully because the pressure change between where it had been and where it was going required care. He had opinions about it, about which posts were worth replacing and which just needed resetting, which sections of wire still had life in them. A pause. He was usually right. Isley looked at the fence. She thought about a boy with opinions about fence wire, about a particular kind of intelligence that expresses itself in the reading of practical things. She thought about the boots beside the door, the neatness of them, the care. "He sounds like he was worth knowing," she said quietly. "Yes." The word was very simple and very complete. They stood there for another moment. The river moved through its trees with its unbroken sound, and the wind came through the dry grass of the open field, and the fence held its new wire taut and straight in the light. "I walk it," Theron said. "The western fence, more than the others." He stopped. "I know why I do it. I'm not sure if it helps or if I just don't know what else to do with the mornings." Isley considered this carefully before she responded. "Maybe both things can be true at the same time," she said. He looked at her then. A long look, the kind he gave rarely, and that meant more for the rarity. She held it steadily. "Maybe," he said, and something in the way he said it suggested he was allowing for the possibility in a way he had not previously allowed for it. which was not a small thing. That evening, the first genuinely cold night of the season arrived with the abruptness of a decision being made. Isley built up the fire in the main room, and Theron brought in more wood without being asked and stacked it beside the hearth in the efficient, unhurried way he did most things. And then he did not leave the room, which was different from previous evenings. He sat in the chair near the fire with a piece of harness leather he was repairing, working at it with the slow, meditative attention of a man giving his hands something to do while his mind occupied itself elsewhere. Isley sat at the table with her father's notebook. She had been making notes in the back pages, observations about the ranch, about what the land needed, about the condition of the animals and the fence lines and the storage of winter provisions. Practical notes, the kind her father had always kept, the running record of a person paying close attention to a specific place. She had not fully acknowledged to herself that she was doing what her father had always done in places he intended to return to. The fire crackled and settled. The harness leather made its small sound under Theron's hands. Outside, the cold pressed against the windows with the patient insistence of a season that has arrived and intends to stay. After a long while, Theron said, without looking up from his work, "Your father. You said he traveled. Always," she said. "I don't think he knew how to stop. Or maybe he did know, and the knowing didn't help." Theron's hand stilled briefly on the leather. "Did he want to? Stop, I mean. I think he wanted to want to. There's a difference." She looked at the fire. He loved people very much, and he was not very good at staying near them. Those two things lived in him at the same time, and neither one ever won. Theron was quiet. His hands resumed their work, slower now. "What happened to him?" he asked. The question was careful, respectful of the possibility that it might not be one she could answer. "He got sick," she said. "The way people get sick when they have spent years not sleeping enough and not eating well and giving everything they had to people who needed it without keeping enough back for themselves." She paused. "He died in a town he'd only been in for 2 weeks. I got there in time, but not by much." The fire settled. A log shifted, sending up a brief brightness. "I'm sorry," Theron said. He said it in the way of someone to whom the words still meant something, who had not used them often enough to wear them smooth. "He left me the notebook," she said, "and the horse, and the bag." She looked at her hands on the open pages. "And the habit of writing things down, which I've come to think is the most useful thing he gave me, because it means when I'm not sure what I think about something, I can find out." She heard the quality of the silence that followed this and looked up. Theron had stopped working entirely and was looking at her with the full attention he rarely gave, the kind that had weight and direction. "What do you write about?" he asked. "When you don't know what you think." She held his gaze. "Lately, this place." The fire made its sound. Outside, the wind moved through the darkness with its cold, purposeful voice, and the house held its warmth against it with the steady reliability of old stone and good timber, and neither of them looked away for a moment that was longer than it needed to be for anything except what it actually was. It was Theron who spoke first. He looked back at the leather in his hands, but his voice when it came was different from his usual voice, lower and less managed. The voice of something coming from a place that had not been visited in a while. "After Eli," he said. He stopped. He picked up the thread again with visible effort. "I thought about leaving. Selling the ranch and going somewhere that didn't have that river in it. Somewhere that wasn't every morning looking at the same sky I looked at that afternoon." His hands were still, but I couldn't. I kept thinking there was something I owed it. Or him. I couldn't tell which. I still can't tell. Isley set down her pen. Maybe you don't have to tell which, she said. Maybe it's enough that you stayed. Staying isn't a virtue if all you're doing is standing in one place refusing to move, he said. It came out harder than she thought he intended, the frustration of a man arguing with himself in the presence of another person. No, she agreed quietly. It isn't. But there's a difference between staying and stopping, and I think you know which one you've been doing. He looked at her sharply. She met the look without flinching. I've been watching you for 2 weeks, she said. You tend those animals every single day with more care than you give yourself or anything else on this property. You rebuilt that fence section. You walked the western line. You put wood on the fire before I asked and coffee on before I was up. She paused. A man who has truly stopped doesn't do those things. A man who has stopped stops entirely. What you've been doing is something else. What have I been doing? His voice was very quiet. Waiting, she said. I think you've been waiting. For what, I don't know. I'm not sure you know either. But those are different things. Stopping and waiting. And the difference matters. The silence that followed this was the longest one they had shared. This silence had a different architecture. It was not empty. It was very full. Theron set the harness leather down on the arm of the chair. He looked at the fire. She watched his face in the firelight, the careful, weathered face of a man who had kept himself under considerable management for a long time, and she watched the management slip, incrementally and without drama, like the surface of frozen water beginning to give in a slow thaw. He put his hand over his face, not covering it exactly. More the gesture of a man applying gentle pressure to something that needed it, both palms against his forehead, elbows on his knees, the posture of someone leaning into a weight rather than away from it. His shoulders did not shake. He made no sound that required acknowledgement, but she could see the quality of his breathing change, could see the effort in the set of his back and the tension in his hands, and she understood that she was seeing something that had not been visible to anyone in a very long time. She did not move toward him. She did not speak. She remained exactly where she was, present and still, which was all that was needed and perhaps the most important thing she had ever offered another person. The simple fact of being there without requirement or reaction, without transforming his moment into something that needed to be managed on her behalf. After a while, his hands came down. He straightened. He looked at the fire, and his breathing was careful and deliberate, and she gave it the time it needed. Then he said, "The day before, he'd asked me to take him to the river, to show him the crossing point on the west side, where the water runs shallow. I said I would. I said tomorrow. I've got fence to run. I'll take you tomorrow." He stopped. Tomorrow I was running the east fence and I heard him and I thought he was playing and I finished my section. He stopped again. A longer pause. I have run that morning through my head so many times that it has stopped feeling like a memory and started feeling like something I'm still inside. Isley was quiet for a moment. She chose her words with the care of someone who understands that the wrong ones, even the well-intentioned wrong ones, can close a door that has taken years to open. You made an ordinary decision, she said. The kind a person makes 100 times a day without consequence. The cruelty of it is not that you chose wrong. It's that you couldn't have known that particular choice was different from any other. I should have gone when he asked. Yes, she said simply, not arguing, not softening. You should have. And you didn't. And you will carry that. But carrying it and being crushed by it are different, and right now you're being crushed. He looked at her. His eyes in the firelight were very dark and very direct, and she could see in them the full weight of 3 years of solitary reckoning, all the mornings at the fence and the evenings at the window, and the careful, relentless, self-administered verdict that had been the only company he had allowed himself. How do you do that? He asked. Say the hard thing without making it worse. My father, she said. He believed that people deserve the truth of their situation, not a comfortable approximation of it. That the truth, even the hard kind, is less damaging than the uncertainty of not knowing where you actually stand. She paused. He also believed in sitting with people while they found their footing, not pulling them up before they were ready, just staying close. Theron was quiet for a long time. The fire had burned down to a deep, steady bed of coals that gave a warm, amber light without the brightness of flame. Your father sounds like someone worth knowing, Theron said finally. He was, she said. He was also someone who never managed to stay in one place long enough to really be known by anyone. He gave everyone he met the best of himself and then moved on. She looked at the fire. I used to think that was generous. Now I think it was partly fear. Of what? She considered. Of being fully seen by someone. Of letting someone know you completely, and then having to live with what they did with that knowledge. The silence after this had a different quality from the others. She became aware, in the way one becomes aware of things gradually and then all at once, that she had said something true about her father and equally true about herself, and that they both knew it, and that the knowing sat between them with a weight that was not uncomfortable, but was significant. Theron looked at her. She looked back. The fire settled in the hearth with a small, domestic sound, and the cold pressed its dark face against the windows, and neither of them looked away. It was Isley who looked down first, back to the open notebook on the table, and she picked up her pen, not because she had anything to write, but because she needed something to do with her hands. She was looking at the notebook when she noticed the page she had turned to. It was near the back, one of the pages her father had written in himself, his small, precise handwriting covering the page in the notes of a man who had passed through a place and found it worth recording. She recognized it. She had turned to this page before, early in her time at the ranch, and had not read the entry fully because she had not been ready for what it said. She read it now. Her father had described the land, the particular quality of the light in the late afternoon, the way the grass moved in the wind coming down from the higher country, the sound of the river on the western edge running clear over limestone in the dry season. He had written about the fence lines and the quality of the soil and the kind of graze the land supported. He had written in the careful observational way of a man who paid close attention to the places he passed through, that this was land that wanted tending, that it had been built to support life and the kind of work that gives a person a reason to rise before the sun, that whoever lived here had something worth keeping, if they could find their way to keeping it. She looked at the page for a long time. Then she looked up. Theron was watching her with a question in his face that he had not put into words. She turned the notebook around and slid it across the table toward him, open to that page, her finger resting lightly below the paragraph about the land and what it wanted. He looked at the page. He read it slowly. with the attention of someone receiving something that requires careful handling. She watched his face as he read, the slight movement at the corner of his eyes, the careful stillness of his expression that told her he was working to maintain it. When he finished, he looked up at her. "He was here," Theron said, not a question. "Years before I was," she said. He wrote about it the way he wrote about places he thought deserved to survive. He didn't do that for every place. He was particular about it. Theron looked at the page again. He reached out and touched the edge of it, not quite touching the writing, just the margin, with one finger. It was a very small gesture. It was not a small thing. He was right, Theron said quietly. About what it wants. "Yes," Easley said. "I think he was." Outside, the cold night settled fully over the land, and the river moved through the dark with its constant, indifferent sound. Inside the old stone house, the fire burned in its steady, reliable way, and two people sat in its light with a notebook open between them. Her father's handwriting, and the space beside it where her own words would go. The old and the new on the same page, each making room for the other. Lorne came back on a morning when the sky was the particular white of weather that has not yet decided what it intends to become. Isley saw him from the eastern field before he reached the gate, recognized the too well-kept horse and the particular quality of his posture in the saddle, the posture of a man who has rehearsed his arrival. She watched him ride in, and then she kept working, because there was work that needed doing, and because she had learned that the most useful thing she could be in moments like this one was present and occupied rather than hovering, which gave the appearance of concern without any of its substance. She finished what she was doing and walked back toward the yard at a pace that was unhurried but not slow. The pace of someone who has their own reasons for going where they are going. Lorne was already inside. She could hear his voice through the open window of the main room, the warm, practiced cadence of it, the particular rhythm of a man who has thought carefully about how he sounds and has arranged himself accordingly. She did not go inside immediately. She stood near the barn door and listened to the quality of the exchange without its content, the rise and fall of it, the places where Theron's shorter, quieter responses fell into the spaces that Lorne's voice created. Then she heard something that changed the temperature of the air around her. She heard Eli's name. She heard it in the way Lorne used it, with a specific gravity that suggested he understood its weight and had chosen to deploy that weight deliberately, at a particular moment in the conversation, for a particular purpose. The name landed in the room, and she heard the silence that followed it. The silence of a man who has been hit in a place that does not have armor, and she moved toward the door. She came in without announcing herself, which was, by now, simply what she did in a house she had been occupying for long enough that its spaces had become familiar. Lorne was seated across the table from Theron with papers laid out between them, 3 or 4 pages of close writing that had the formal quality of documents prepared with professional assistance. Theron was looking at the papers. His hands were flat on the table on either side of them, the posture of a man who has not yet picked something up and is still in the process of deciding whether he will. Lorne looked up when she entered. His expression adjusted itself to warmth with the practiced speed of a man for whom adjustment is a skill he has developed to a high level. "Miss Hart," he said, "I didn't know you were still with us." "Still passing through," she said, which was what she always said, and which was becoming, with each repetition, less accurate, and both of them knew it. She looked at the papers on the table. She looked at Theron's hands, flat on the wood, very still. She looked at Lorne's face with its careful warmth and its watching eyes. I was just explaining to Theron, Lorne said, that the arrangement I'm proposing is really in everyone's interest. The ranch needs a level of management that one person alone cannot reasonably provide. I have resources and connections that could bring this property back to what it was. He paused, and in the pause, he let the next words arrive with gentle weight. What Eli would have wanted to see it be. The name again, placed with precision, like a key in a specific lock. Theron did not move, but she saw something happen in the muscles of his jaw, a slight tightening and then a deliberate release, the physical evidence of a man applying considerable internal force to keep his surface still. Isley moved to the kitchen end of the room and put water on without asking, because putting water on was a thing that needed doing, and because having something to do with her hands gave her a reason to stay in the room without making her presence into a statement. She kept her back to them while she worked and she listened. Lorne was explaining the papers. His language was careful and reasonable, every clause framed as protection rather than acquisition, as assistance rather than transfer. He used words like stewardship and partnership and legacy, words with genuine meanings that he had hollowed out and filled with his own intentions. And if she had not been paying the particular quality of attention she was paying, she might have heard only the surfaces of them. She turned around. What does the agreement actually transfer? She asked. She said it conversationally, without accusation, the way she asked about the contents of a storage crate, as someone simply interested in accurate information. Lorne looked at her with his warm, patient expression. It's a management arrangement. Theron retains ownership. Retains ownership of what, specifically? She came to the table and looked at the papers, not picking them up, just looking, reading what was visible from where she stood. Because management rights over land that include decision-making authority over its use, its sale, and its development are functionally equivalent to ownership in most circumstances that matter. Lorne's expression did not change. This was, she noted, either the mark of a man with very good self-control or a man who had anticipated this line of inquiry and prepared for it, and she was not certain which was more concerning. Theron and I have known each other for years, Lorne said. This is a family arrangement. Of a sort, Isley said quietly. She saw it then. The first genuine thing she had seen on Lorne's face, so brief it was barely a flicker, there and gone in less than a second. Not anger. Something more calculated than anger. The expression of a man making a rapid reassessment. She looked at Theron. He was looking at her. His eyes had the quality she had come to recognize as his full attention, the look that was rare, and that meant more for its rarity. Lorne stood up. He gathered the papers with the unhurried efficiency of a man who is not retreating but repositioning. I don't want to rush anything, he said. This deserves proper thought. I'll leave these with you, Theron. Read them at your own pace. I'll come back when you've had time to consider. He looked at Isley with his warm, careful eyes. It's clear you care about this place, he said. That speaks well of you. And then, softer, so that it almost had the quality of something private. It also makes me wonder what happens to that care when you move on. As you said yourself, you're passing through. He left. The room was very quiet after his horse had moved out of the yard. Theron sat at the table with the papers in front of him and did not move. Isley stood at the kitchen end of the room and let the silence have the time it needed. The water on the stove began its low, preliminary sound, not yet boiling, just warming toward it. He's been coming for 3 years, Theron said. Every few months. always with something new, always reasonable, always with Eli's name in it somewhere. He looked at the papers. He knew Eli. Not well, but enough. Enough to know where it lands. Yes, Isley said. He knows exactly where it lands. Theron looked up at her. You think I shouldn't sign? I think you know you shouldn't sign, she said carefully. I think you've known it each time he's come, and you've found reasons not to. And I think today you were closer than you've been before, because he said the name at the right moment and you were already tired. The accuracy of this landed visibly. She watched him receive it. What would you do? He asked. It was a genuine question, asked without deflection. I would read every word of those papers, she said. Not for what they say, for what they don't say. The things that are not in a document are usually more important than the things that are. He looked at the papers for a long moment. Then he pushed them to the side of the table, not away, just aside, out of the center. A small but clear rearrangement. Later, he said. And then, to her surprise, will you read them with me? She looked at him. He was asking with the directness of someone who has gotten past a certain kind of pride, not abandoned it, but gotten past the part of it that prevents necessary requests. Yes, she said, tonight. She went to the barn in the afternoon to check on Jed, who had been moving more slowly for the past several days in a way she had been watching with the quiet concern of someone who notices the body's signals before the person in the body does. She found him in the far stall, sitting on an overturned bucket in a way that told her he had sat down because he had needed to, and not because he had intended to. She crouched beside him without making an event of it. She put 2 fingers on his wrist in the same unhurried way she did everything and felt what she felt. How long have you been feeling this way? She asked. Few weeks, Jed said. He had the look of a man who knew he had been caught doing something he should have mentioned earlier and was preparing his justification. More than a few weeks, she said, not unkindly, simply accurately. He exhaled. Since the end of summer. On and off. Thought it would pass. Have you eaten today? A pause that was long enough to be an answer. She went to the house and came back with food and made him eat it slowly, sitting on the overturned bucket in the afternoon light of the barn while the horses moved in their stalls and the calf, fully recovered now, watched the proceedings with the alert, curious expression of an animal that had developed opinions about the people around it. Jed ate without argument, which told her more than argument would have about how he was actually feeling. He was a man who did not accept help easily, who had organized his life around being useful, and who experienced the reversal of that arrangement as something close to shame. The fact that he ate without protest meant the resources he might have used to resist were occupied elsewhere. She sat with him while he ate, and then she sat with him afterward, the two of them in the barn with its warmth and its animal sounds, and she thought about what she was seeing. Jed had been working at 3/4 capacity for months, pushing himself past what his body was comfortably able to do because the ranch needed it and because Theron was not in a condition to notice, and because Jed was the kind of man who would quietly work himself into the ground before he would add his difficulty to someone else's burden. He had been doing what faithful people do, absorbing the cost of the situation into himself and presenting a surface that suggested everything was manageable. She thought about Theron not noticing. She thought about what it meant that a man could be so fully occupied by his own interior darkness that the person most loyal to him could be failing quietly at the end of a barn and the fact of it not reach him. She thought about what she was going to have to say and how. She found Theron at the fence, the western fence, where he went without consciously deciding to, the way water finds its level without trying. He was standing at the repaired section, the one with the new posts that they had set together, his hands resting on the top wire. She came and stood beside him and did not immediately speak. After a while he said, without turning, "How bad is it?" "He needs rest," she said. "Real rest. Not the rest of doing slightly less than usual. He needs to stop completely for a period of time and let his body recover." She paused. "He's been carrying more than he should have for longer than he should have. His body has been compensating and it's run through its reserves." Theron's hands tightened on the wire. She saw the knuckles change color. "He didn't tell me," Theron said. "No. He should have told me." "Yes," she said. "He should have. He didn't because he didn't want to be a burden on top of everything else." She let this sit for a moment before she continued. "And he was able to make that decision because you weren't present enough to see it coming. That's not an accusation. That's just what it is." The silence that followed this was a different kind of silence from the ones they had shared by the fire. This one had edges. She felt him processing what she had said, the initial resistance, and then the settling. The particular quality of a person accepting a hard truth that they already knew and had been avoiding. "I've been absent," he said. His voice was very flat, the flatness of someone pressing down on something that would otherwise be very loud. "In the way that people are absent when they're surviving something," she said, "which is real and which has a cost. And the cost is that Jed paid some of it." Theron turned from the fence. He looked out at the open field, the dry grass moving in the cold afternoon light, and his face had the expression she recognized now as the one that came just before something shifted in him, the held quality of a man at the edge of something. "What do I do?" he asked. He said it the way he had asked her to read the papers with him, with the directness of someone who has arrived, finally, at the honest question after a long time of asking the wrong ones. "You take care of Jed," she said, "and while you're doing that, you take care of the ranch. Not because it can be recovered overnight or because anything will be simple, but because it's yours and it's still here. And Jed has given years of his life to it, and it deserves to be tended by the person who owns it." He looked at her. "And the papers," she added. "We read the papers tonight, and we find what's in the spaces between the words. And then you decide from a position of knowing rather than from a position of being tired." He held her eyes. The afternoon light was the low, amber light of a sun moving toward the horizon, and it made the field behind him look like something from a painting, golden and particular and temporary. "You said we," he said. She had said we. She was aware that she had said we. "I did," she said, and did not qualify it. That evening they sat at the table with the papers spread between them, and she read them with the slow, methodical attention her father had applied to anything that required understanding before it could be acted upon. She read each paragraph twice, once for what it said, and once for what it implied. And she made notes in the margins of her own notebook in the small, precise hand she had inherited without knowing she was inheriting it. Theron sat across from her and watched her read, and then read the sections she indicated, and then sat back and looked at the ceiling while she explained what she had found in the language between the lines. The management arrangement was constructed around a clause that defined abandonment of the property in terms broad enough that a period of absence or a period of insufficient maintenance, as determined by a third party, could trigger a transfer of decision-making authority. The definition of insufficient maintenance was not specific. The identity of the third party who would make that determination was not named. It was elegant in the way that effective traps are elegant, minimal, and functional, doing what it needed to do without ornamentation. Theron looked at the papers for a long time after she finished explaining. "He built the door," Theron said slowly, "and then waited for me to walk through it on my own." "He's been watching for 3 years for the right moment," she said. "Tonight, he thought he'd found it." "Tonight I was close," Theron said. He said it without evasion. The flat honesty of a man accounting for himself accurately. "Yes," she said. "You were." He looked at her across the papers. The fire was low, the room warm but dimming toward the intimate darkness of a late evening, and his face in that light was the face she had come to know over these weeks, weathered and careful and currently, unusually, open in a way that the full daylight did not always allow. "Isley," he said. He had used her name before, but not with this particular quality, not with the weight of everything that had accumulated between them present in the single word. The fence posts and the roof in the rain and the conversation by the fire and the notebook open to her father's handwriting. "You're not passing through," he said. It was not a question. It had the quality of something being named that had been true for some time and had simply been waiting for the accurate words. She looked at him steadily. She thought about her father, who had loved places and people completely, and then moved on because staying required a courage that moving did not. She thought about the word "we," which she had said this afternoon at the fence without deciding to, which had come out of her mouth with the ease of something that was simply true. "No," she said, "I'm not." Outside, the cold night pressed against the old stone walls, and the house held its warmth with the patient reliability of something built for exactly this. And somewhere in the dark beyond the yard, the western fence stood at the edge of the property with its new posts and its taut wire, holding the line between what had been lost and what was still here, between the afternoon that could not be undone and the morning that was still, quietly, coming. She reached across the table and turned the papers face down, not throwing them away, not pretending they did not exist, simply removing them from the center of things, which was where they did not belong. Theron looked at her hand on the papers. Then he looked at her face. Then, for the first time since she had arrived at this ranch on a late afternoon with a limping horse and no particular plan, Percival Lorne's careful, reasonable voice stopped being the loudest thing in the room. Jed rested. He did not do it gracefully. He did it the way men who have built their entire sense of usefulness around constant motion do it, with protest and negotiation and the periodic attempt to redefine rest as something that could be accomplished, while also doing one or two small things that needed doing. Isley managed this with the patient, unhurried firmness she applied to animals that needed treatment they did not want, simply redirecting without argument each time he reached for something he was not supposed to reach for, until eventually he stopped reaching and accepted the horizontal position with the resigned dignity of a man who has run out of counter-arguments. Theron took care of the barn, not because Isley asked him to, not because the circumstance had forced his hand. He simply appeared in the barn before dawn on the first morning of Jed's rest, and did the work that needed doing with the quiet, thorough attention of a man who had always known how to do this, and was returning to it the way you return to a language you learned first, before any other. The one that lives in the body rather than the mind. She watched him from a careful distance and said nothing, and felt something settle in her chest that had been without a resting place for a long time. Lorne came back 4 days later. He came in the early afternoon when the light was flat and clear and offered no atmospheric assistance to anyone, which suited Isley because she had no interest in atmosphere. She was in the yard when he arrived, and she stayed in the yard, and when Theron came out of the barn to meet him, she moved to stand beside Theron in the way she had moved to stand beside him at the water trough on the first day, because it seemed then, and it seemed now, that proximity was a kind of statement that did not require words. Lorne looked at them both. His practiced warmth was present and intact, but she could see, beneath it, the recalibration happening in real time. The rapid assessment of a man who has arrived expecting one situation and found another. "I came to see if you'd had time to consider," Lorne said to Theron. His voice was as warm as it had ever been. His eyes were doing something different from his voice. "I've considered," Theron said. "And?" "No." A single word, delivered without heat or elaboration, in the voice of a man who has located the ground beneath his feet and is standing on it without drama. Lorne waited for more, and when more did not come, something shifted in the architecture of his expression, the practiced warmth becoming just slightly less practiced. "Theron," he said, and the name carried in it the weight of history, of years of careful cultivation, of all the visits and the reasonable language and the patient deployment of Eli's name at the right moments. "I'm trying to help you. You know that." "I know what you've said," Theron replied. "I've read what you brought. All of it. Carefully." He paused. "I know what the word abandonment means in that document, and I know who gets to define it, and I know what happens if they define it in your interest rather than mine." Lorne was still for a moment. When he spoke again, the warmth had been replaced by something more honest, which she appreciated even as she recognized it as a last attempt at a different kind of leverage. "You're making a mistake," he said. "This ranch is beyond what one man can manage. You've been watching it decline for 3 years. I'm offering you a way out of that." "You're offering yourself a way in," Theron said. "Which is a different thing." Lorne looked at Aisley then. He looked at her with the eyes that were always counting something, and she could see him counting now, tallying what had changed since his last visit and arriving at an accurate sum. "You've been busy," he said to her, not unkindly, with the respect, she thought, of a man acknowledging that he has been outplayed by a better hand. "I've been helping," she said simply. He looked at them both for a moment longer. Then he gathered himself with the quiet efficiency of a man who understands when a position is no longer tenable and who has the intelligence to leave before the leaving becomes something worse than leaving. He nodded once to Theron, with a correctness that had shed its warmth entirely, and was therefore, she thought, more genuine than anything he had shown them before. He rode out of the yard and did not look back. Theron stood beside her and watched him go. Neither of them spoke until the sound of the hoofbeats had faded entirely into the distance, and the yard was quiet again with its ordinary quiet, the wind in the dry grass, the horses in the barn, the old gray with the white blaze moving in his stall. "That's done," Theron said. "That's done," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to show you something." She followed him around the side of the house to the kitchen garden, the plot she had noticed on her first afternoon, the good soil with its minimal, purely functional planting. He stopped at the edge of it and looked at it with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Something that was not quite the openness of the fireside evenings and not quite the focused competence of the working hours. Something new and still finding its form. "My wife planted this," he said. "Isley absorbed this quietly. He had not spoken of her before. She had not asked. There were things in a house that spoke for themselves, and she had felt the presence of this woman in the deliberate spacing of those garden rows from her very first afternoon, in a layout that spoke of someone who had understood growing things and had cared about getting them right before Eli was born. She had intentions for it, herbs and vegetables and some things she called medicinal, plants her grandmother had grown. He looked at the bare, functional rows. After she died, I kept it going. Basics only. Enough to be useful. He paused. I'd like to plant it properly again, the way she intended. I don't know all the things she had in mind, but I thought, given what you know about medicinal plants, about what your father taught you. He stopped. He was not someone who over-explained, and he did not over-explain now. Simply stopped at the point where the meaning was clear and let it stand. Isley looked at the garden. She looked at the good, dark soil, the potential in it, the space that had been preserved even when nothing had been tended properly. Even in the years of decline, this plot had been maintained, the soil turned each season, the basics planted. She understood now that this was not negligence with an exception. This was a man who had let the large things go and held on to the small ones that mattered most. And this small patch of ground had mattered most. And he had not known how to explain that to anyone because there had been no one to explain it to. Tell me what she liked, Isley said. Whatever you remember. I'll tell you what I know how to grow. He told her. Not all at once, not in any organized way, but in the fragmentary, associative way that memory works when it has been stored in the body rather than the mind. A detail here and a detail there. The color of something she had grown one year. The smell of something she had dried in the kitchen. The name of a plant she had asked him to watch for on the western pasture because it grew wild there in early spring. Isley listened and asked occasional quiet questions and made notes in the back of her father's notebook, in the pages that had been blank and were slowly becoming something else. When she looked up from the notebook, she found him watching her write with an expression that stopped her for a moment. It was the expression of a man watching something be given back to him that he had believed was gone permanently, seeing it exist again in a form that was different from the original but was real, was present, was here. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the afternoon light lay over the kitchen garden with its flat, clear honesty, and there was nothing between them now that had not been said or shown or understood. She reached into the deep pocket of her coat and drew out the leather strap she kept her father's notebook closed with, the same strap that had kept it closed through years of travel, through all the mornings she had opened it to read his handwriting in places that were not her own. She wound it around the closed notebook, slowly. My father kept this notebook for 30 years, she said. He wrote in every place he went. He had a rule about it. He said the only entries worth keeping were about places that changed something in him, places that rearranged the furniture. She looked at the notebook in her hands. He had a lot of entries. Theron was very still, listening with the quality of attention he gave to things that mattered. This place has more pages than anywhere else he wrote about, she said. He only came through once, one afternoon, as far as I can tell. But he wrote about it like someone who understood that he was passing something he should remember. She looked up. I used to wonder why. Now I think I know. Why? Theron asked. Because it was the kind of place that shows you what it could be, she said. Not what it is, what it intends to be if someone stays long enough to help it get there. He reached out then, not toward the notebook, toward her hand, which was resting on the garden fence post, and he covered it with his own hand in the simple, unhurried way of a man who has been a long time arriving somewhere and is now, finally, there. His hand was warm and rough with calluses and very still, and she turned her palm up under his without thinking about it, without any of the consideration she usually applied to the choices she made about proximity and contact and what she was willing to allow herself to want. They stood at the edge of the kitchen garden in the flat afternoon light, and neither of them spoke, because there was nothing that needed saying that was not already present in the contact between their two hands, in the garden in front of them, with its good soil waiting, in the repaired fence visible at the back of the yard, in the barn where an old horse stood patient in his stall, and a calf that had been dying was learning to be well. Evening came on slowly, the way it does in open country, the light pulling back from the edges of things before it pulls back from the center, leaving the world briefly in a state of amber suspension before the dark comes fully in. Isley sat on the porch steps with her father's notebook and opened it to the last blank page. She sat for a while with her pen in her hand, looking out at the yard, at the barn, at the fence line visible against the darkening sky. Then she wrote. Not much. A few lines in her own handwriting alongside her father's, in the same notebook, on the same pages. The same habit given to her by the same hands that had written what she was now reading alongside her own words. She wrote about the quality of the light at this particular hour over this particular piece of land. She wrote about the sound of the wind in the dry grass and the way the old barn held its shape against the sky with the solid permanence of something that had been built to last. She wrote one line about the garden and what it was going to become. She closed the notebook. Theron came out of the barn and crossed the yard and came to the porch and sat beside her on the steps, not close enough to be without choice, close enough to be a choice. The old gray horse was visible through the open barn door, standing in the evening quiet with his long, patient face. "Jed wants to know if he can sit up for supper," Theron said. "He can sit up for supper," she said, "not for anything else. I'll tell him." He did not move. He sat beside her on the porch steps and looked out at the yard the way she had been looking at it, with the particular quality of attention that is not searching for anything specific, but simply receiving what is there. After a while, she said, "The garden will need turning before the first hard frost." "I know," he said. "And the north fence line needs a full assessment before winter, not just the western section." "I know." She looked at him. He was looking at the barn, at the old horse, at the yard that was his, and that he was looking at now the way he had looked at it once before, a long time ago, before the afternoon by the river, with the eyes of someone who is present in the place he inhabits. "I'm going to need somewhere to keep the horse," she said, "through the winter at least, until the leg is fully sound." He turned his head and looked at her then, with the full, steady attention that was rare, and that she had come to understand was not rarity for its own sake, but the natural result of a man who did not spend his attention on things that did not deserve it. "The stall at the end of the row," he said. "It's hers." She nodded. She looked back at the barn. "And the room," she said. "Down the hall." "It's yours," he said. Quiet and certain, the way he said things he had thought through completely. "It's been yours." The dark came fully in over the ranch with the patient, unhurried inevitability of all the evenings that had come before it, settling over the old stone house and the barn and the kitchen garden and the fence lines, over the western pasture and the river moving through its trees, over everything that had endured the years of neglect and the weight of grief and the long, difficult winter of a man's refusal to let himself want anything. Inside, Jed was sitting up for supper. Outside, two people sat on the porch steps in the dark and did not say anything more for a while, because there was nothing more that needed saying tonight, and because the silence between them had long since stopped being empty and become instead the comfortable, inhabited silence of people who have found, against considerable odds and through no simple path, that they are, at last, exactly where they are supposed to be. The old horse settled in his stall. The notebook sat closed on the porch step between them, her father's words and her own resting together on the same pages, each making room for the other. And somewhere in the dark at the back of the yard, the fence held its new wire taut against the night, steady and purposeful, the way things hold when they have been properly attended to by the right hands at the right time.